So I saw Beau is Afraid. As a non-spoiler review, Beau is Afraid is effectively a best-of compilation of iconography, scene concepts, and themes. A self-indulgent, beautiful mess where describing the plot does it a disservice. And that's all you're gonna get, because I'm gonna be spoiling it from here on out. So this Charlie Kaufman fella made a new movie, and I have to say I'm very much enjoying the progression of his filmography, growing from small-scale projects to much more ambitious epics that still maintain the humanist core. But this growth isn't just limited to his scripts, as his aesthetic palette has clearly broadened in a much more refined taste. A welcome step on his directorial path, as his earlier films were littered with derivative symmetry, pun intended. Jokes aside, Ari Aster's Charlie Kaufman influence is more than apparent, but as I previously hinted at, Aster's filmography has been defined by previous works before him. Hereditary derives from Don't Look Now with sprinkled seasoning of Antichrist and Carrie, which is all framed in a stage play-esque aesthetic reminiscent of The Cook, the Thief, His Lover, and His Wife, which is recontextualized as a parallel to Annie's Miniatures, whilst Midsommar derives from The Wicker Man and modern romance, combining the stage play aesthetic with technicolor that alludes to the films like Wizard of Oz. This playful building block mentality is not new to cinema or art as a whole, nor is Aster the only one to do it. That being said, it's rare to see a filmmaker boldly proclaim their influences. Perhaps this is why Scorsese has grown such a fondness for Aster, as he has been both criticized and hailed for using film history as a foundation for his own ideas. This becomes doubly ironic when you consider the Kaufman influence, as Kaufman is well known for his intertextuality. Considering nearly all of Kaufman's films are built on author self-inserts, it would make sense for him to include his knowledge of films into the diegetic. But in the case of I'm Thinking of Ending Things, the intertextual references extend far beyond Easter eggs and nods of appreciation. Instead, intertextuality is used as a narrative device to explore Jake's loneliness. In place of friends and relationships, Jake found comfort in media, a comfort that perpetuated his loneliness and escalated his self-hatred. Thus, the intertextual references are framed through the subjective perspective of the protagonist, and showcasing how Jake can no longer distinguish reality and fiction. Combine this with the fact that I'm Thinking of Ending Things is an adaptation, and the meta-cacophony becomes an Ouroboros, an intentional confusion of beginning and ending that reflects the morphing of identities in our relationship with the world. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why this lengthy diatribe? Well, aside from the conceptual influences, Beau is Afraid can be read as a pseudo-meta commentary on Aster's filmography, with the titular Beau acting as author self-insert, stumbling from one absurdity to the next. I don't exactly believe this film is trying to be an in-depth critique or commentary on the creative process, or the relationship between artist and audience, but there are a few too many parallels to keep the thread from being completely frayed. As I mentioned before, Aster continues his cold mechanical cinematography that acts as a visualization of his character's lack of agency. The adherence to formalist compositions of Hereditary and Midsommar create a dissonance between audience and character, as the camera is from the point of view from the higher-up beings that control their fate. Whilst this is a revelation in Hereditary and an outright statement in Midsommar, Beau is Afraid reverses the horror that comes from lack of agency into outright comedy, consistently reminding the audience of the metaphorical god that is Aster pulling the strings. It's funny to me to think that I was writing a video on how Aster's horror doesn't derive from traditional conventions, but uses the loss of agency in sympathetic and empathetic characters to create true horror, only for Aster to make it a complete joke. A similar mentality applies to the film's structure. Instead of adhering to a traditional 3 or 5 act structure with clear cause and effect and plot progression, Beau is Afraid is told in largely self-contained episodic vignettes, with just enough textual and subtextual connection between them to keep it from feeling meaningless. This meta-joke extends to the constant breaking of the film's verisimilitude. Textually, it showcases the destabilizing effects of anxiety and trauma conveyed through nightmare logic. But through this meta-commentary lens, the escalation of absurdity and breaking of verisimilitude is used to poke fun at his own shock value moments, as nothing more than simply wanting to shock the audience even if it breaks the diegetic. Whilst the absurdist logic of Synecdoche, New York is indicative of Caden's eventual loss of control of his play, it has a lot more subtextual meat than this video would do any justice to. That isn't to say Beau is Afraid needed stronger subtextual implications to more grandiose themes, but the film would certainly have more pull for rewatch value if it did. The This is an incredibly charitable reading of the film. I understand that someone may see these readings as nothing more than justifying a 3-hour mess, but Aster is no stranger to provocation. I certainly wouldn't say that Aster is up there with the Von Triers and Briards, but for Western audiences, Aster does have some pretty provocative imagery. So what better way to poke fun at that provocation by having a giant penis monster at the end of a very suspenseful scene, that in a typical Aster film would end with dreadful graphic horror. That isn't to say the film consistently sabotages drama for the sake of comedy. Every frame of Patti LuPone oozes Aster's knack for writing compelling dysfunctional families, and the entire play sequence gives the film some much needed emotional depth. Many will point to the sequence as the most overt Synecdoche, New York plagiarism, but in actuality, it's exactly an episode of Adventure Time, where Finn is transported into a pillow world and lives his entire life in that world, falling in love, raising a family, all whilst trying to get back home. This episode gave me existential nightmares. All of this chaos culminates in the final scene of Judgment, a Pink Floyd's The Wall-esque ending that judges all of Beau's life, obviously acting as further gaslighting for Beau's Freudian mother. But the scene offers perhaps the cruelest meta joke, a crowd full of American sports fans silently observing Beau's fate, only to slowly leave in disappointment upon the unceremonious ending. No thesaurus holds the amount of synonyms I want to use for how blunt this scene is. A film that is continually poke fun at its audience gives you the middle finger and tells you to leave. And whilst I always prefer meta commentary as insightful over intentional emotional reaction, nothing will beat my attempt to hold back laughter in a silent cinema when the credits rolled. This is a film that wants to create a divided fanbase, which something can be said for how effective it is to integrate that very discourse into the film rather than having audiences provoke it, but I respect it nonetheless. And as someone that's always wanted to see an adaptation of Antkind, I guess this is the closest thing I'll ever get to it. I wanted to ditch the numbers rating system at the end of my videos in the favor of more subtextual readings of film, but for tradition's sake, I'm going to give this a 7 or 8 out of 10. Who knows?